Barley's been an area historically many years ago that was sandy, full of skeleton weed, low rainfall, full of eelworm.
Still is low rainfall.
Danny, why are you growing pulses in Dandaley? Are you gone crazy?
Yeah, I've gone crazy. Still is low rainfall, Snuffy. Actually nodulating all right. I don't know, it's a bit of this diversity thing, isn't it? And we talked a lot about it yesterday. We had a field day yesterday, pretty similar sort of theme to today. But I'm pretty concerned about nitrogen in the Mallee. You know, in the last 10, 20 years, what's one of the main things we've removed off our farm? It's nitrogen, isn't it? And nitrogen just doesn't appear. The soil just doesn't keep making nitrogen. It loses its ability to continue to make nitrogen if we continue to take it out and don't include in our program something that can manufacture some nitrogen for us. Can you guys hear all down the back there? Yep, no worries. So it is, you know, it's something, and it stands out, doesn't it? Who spent a lot of money on urea the last 2, 3, 4 years, and increasingly? Has anyone spent less money on nitrogen? No? I think we're all spending more and more on nitrogen, and we're taking still a lot more nitrogen out of the system than it's going back in. Nitrogen is really simple stuff. It's in and out. We can easily measure what goes out. It's actually not that difficult to measure what goes into the system. So you know, at some point in time, we're going to need to rebalance the scales. We can't keep taking. At some stage, we're going to have to start giving back into the system. And we're starting to get a lot more confidence around nitrogen and legumes in particular. We've got a lot of questions really to answer in terms of how much nitrogen are we putting back into the system. Driving around, you know, Matt and I and the other guys see it time and time again, even 2 and 3 years after a legume, a cereal crop will benefit. You know, canola's a bit of a concern for us. It's a good crop and we still want it in our system, but we're understanding more and more how much nitrogen it uses and what that means, not for just that crop but also the next one and the one after that.
Looking at a range of the grain legumes similar to this, plus or minus inoculum applied at sowing, and we've found a few crops that you just would not grow without inoculum. Lupins is one, chickpeas is another. They yielded very poorly without it. Their input into our system would have been quite poor. But to actually establish what the carryover effect was, we've sown both those sites back to wheat this year, and also done soil tests on them too. We've found just recently by doing NDVI, or a measurement of biomass production, how much growth the wheat has put on over those last year's grown legume crops. And we've found that where we've inoculated, even on some of the crops that didn't seem to actually need too much inoculum for themselves, field peas would be one example, we are picking up a bit of a residual impact this year in the wheat. The wheat's doing a bit better where we have inoculated, and it seems like some crops can generate enough N to satisfy themselves, but by putting inoculum on, which is fairly cheap anyway, we can actually maybe give a boost to next year. And that's the sort of work we'll follow through. We obviously haven't got the yield yet, but that's the work on those 2 sites that started last year, and that's what we'll continue with here next year. To get the full economic picture, we need 2 years from legumes or more.
There. But first of all, I might just hand over to Mallee. Mallee, I might just get you to talk about how we get confidence in the trials that we're doing. Obviously, we want to be able to say the results we want to get here, we want to be able to extend out in the field, and we want to have confidence that the results we generate here would occur in someone else's farm in a particular area. So how are we going to get confidence, Mallee, that what we establish here is going to be information we can use going forward with confidence?
Okay, and that's hitting on one of the big differences between a demo and an actual trial or experiment. What we're doing here is replicated field experiments where we have each variety you can see labelled along here is also repeated behind us and behind that again, and in some of the trials we have what we call 4 replications. By doing that experimental design, we can then actually analyse the results statistically and come up with the confidence level as to whether those results are going to occur again or not. Usually the confidence level we will use is 95%. So if we say something's different in another treatment within that trial, with 95% confidence level, it means that we expect it to occur 19 out of 20 times if we did it again. You always get the odd chance where it may not, but 95% gives you a fair confidence that you can use information coming out of these trials and make decisions on. So that's what we're about. We're using standardised experimental designs and statistical analysis.
5 years I've been growing probably 1 to 2 barleys, namely Hindmarsh and Scope, I guess. We're growing any other barleys that, I guess, no, mainly Scope, Hindmarsh. So I guess we all know the limitations of both those varieties. Hindmarsh has been a fantastic barley over the last 5 to 8 years, or since it's been in the Mallee and in the Wimmera, and so I think we'd have to be pretty happy that the way that's performed over the years. It's got its limitations. We know on sand it's not real good in terms of when it tries to compete with grass weeds, and apart from its lack of early competition, it just doesn't like sand. So it probably doesn't tick the box in all soil types, but where we've got medium loams to heavy loams, Hindmarsh has been an absolute winner. And I think we're only sort of seeing it the last year or two, starting to get a little bit sort of smashed by spot form of net blotch, just like we're seeing Scope. So apart from that, Hindmarsh has been a real winner. So what have we got to replace Hindmarsh, since that's been the mainstream variety? Most of us are growing Scope barley. It's been a good yielding variety. It probably performs a lot better on sand compared to Hindmarsh, where vice versa, it probably doesn't like those loams compared to Hindmarsh. So overall, Scope, yeah, it does well on our sand, which is where we want it to be, but it's got, the limitations are it's breeding eelworm. When I was with the department for a couple of years, Snuffy, I cut my teeth on CCN research, and all these new varieties that the breeding companies released, they were really trying to fight each other to get that first CCN resistant variety. For perhaps late sowing and early finishes in the Mallee, it's definitely had a place. It's like most varieties, it probably wasn't ideal in every aspect, in every agronomic sort of aspect we wanted. It sucker for eelworm, it sprouted mainly on that first rain, so it was a real, in terms of agronomics, it probably wasn't the ideal wheat, but it did have a place in an early finish. It seemed to fill before the weather got real hot and moisture and stressed the grain, so, and it yielded in tight finishes. Now we've got a Clearfield axe. This is from AGT, based out of South Australia, and they're imminent release, so they'll probably release it post-harvest as a Clearfield axe type. So yeah, it doesn't fit the bill in everything we want, but yeah, it's another alternative, Clearfield alternative.
Fit in our rotation. If we actually get an early rain, early autumn sort of rain in March, I guess we've got the option of being able to safely sow some wedgetail, and it'll grow and use up that moisture that we've got without actually running up to head like the Clearfield. It's got a vernalisation or a cold requirement, so it'll sit there over winter before it actually starts to mature.
I think it fits really well in the years where you have a wet summer, you've got a full profile of moisture, and you want to sow something early. You can sow this in March, okay, and what it does is its roots, I think roots grow about 12 millimetres a day, and it puts down this massive root system, okay, that goes well beyond the other wheats we grow, and it taps into more moisture. And because it's growing vegetably for so long, it creates lots of tillers. So this stuff here, if it's sown early and does its job, can actually go and yield a lot higher than your Kurax, your Maces, your Yippies, because it's growing for a lot longer, it's got deeper roots, it produces more tillers, and that can be a yield response for you. So there's an operational advantage. You can sow it nice and early, get your seeder ready, test your VRA out, and you can get that yield advantage. But it only happens in some years where you've got subsoil moisture and probably an early break to be able to sow it. So. we'll talk about the chemical control of brome just quickly, and then we'll talk about some of the other things we're doing to get away from chemicals, which may be working on brome and helping us out in the future. But this is a pre-emergent trial for brome grass, so there's nothing on here post-emergent for brome. It's all done with the pre-emergents, and all the pre-emergents are written on those green signs. And at the bottom of it's got two things. It's got the cost, and it's got the percent control that's given in the yearly counts. So, and if you go down the end there, there's the untreated. So if you get one thing out of today, make sure you have a look at the untreated to look at the pressure that it would have been if we hadn't put anything on the plots. It's quite contrasting, okay? So you probably don't realise what percent control you can get out of pre-emergence. Now it's worked particularly well here because this is a pole stubble last year, okay? And a lot of the pre-emergence actually hit the ground and hasn't been tied up in stubble, okay? So that's one key thing. You probably don't know, but the pre-emergence is probably going to be the key for brome control in the future, okay? There's going to be a day where we can't control brome with selects, verdict, or Midas on duty, okay? So those days are coming. So the question is, what are we going to do now to A, prolong it, or B, farm without those herbicides? Because we're doing resistance testing, there's more paddocks showing up where those herbicides aren't working. So in 5 or 10 years, we mightn't have verdict, we mightn't have selects properly, and we mightn't have the yimmies, okay? The question is, how are we going to farm? How are we going to make money if we don't have those tools? You know, can we grow legumes? You know, how do we grow cereals with brome grass? And the key, what I can gather, is the pre-emergence. Because the pre-emergents aren't the group A's and B's, they're the group J's, the K's, the M's, all that kind of stuff. They are the ones that are going to last longer into the future to control brome grass. And we're getting about 90% control with the best pre-emergent herbicides, okay? So you look at ones like Sakura and Avadex, there's some new confidential ones that might come out. They're getting about 90% control of brome grass as a pre-em, okay? So once you get that level of control, you really take away a lot of the pressure and yield becomes unrestricted to a degree, okay? If you're getting 100 plants a square metre of brome grass, you're getting between 30 and 50% yield loss with brome grass, okay? I'll say that again. If you've got 100 plants a square metre of brome, which is well and truly in the control, you're getting 30 to 50% yield loss with brome. So it is a very taxing weed to have on your farm, okay, if it gets out of control, all right? So you can have a look at the plots and the control methods and the options, and I'll say it's got the percentage control, so they may not be totally accurate now because the counts are done a month ago, but it'll give you a good guide to what the pre-emergents are giving you, because this is probably going to be the future of how we're going to control brome. This, windrow burning, hay, it's not going to be a clearfield wheat followed by pulses perhaps in the future. It's going to be completely different thinking, okay? We're going to be right for another couple of years, maybe another 5 years, but eventually those herbicides are going to come out, and there's nothing to replace the verdict selects. There's nothing really to replace the group Bs, okay? The ones, when you go up the group, the ones become the pre-emergents, okay?
It's a different seeding system, but we might just start with Moddies while it's here. Pretty well documented. I spoke to Darren the other day before the weekend. He's obviously gone to the seed master. He's had a disc for about five years, was it, Snuffy? Yep, 5 years. So he's just talking a bit about the journey, and the reason he went into the disc was, you know, water use efficiency and productivity.
This is Rosina Vetch sowing early April, Pete, was it? Yep, early April, yep. This paddock here, you look across it, has got quite a lot of crab holes in it, so it's got quite substantial subsoil constraints. So basically when you get down to 15-20 centimetres, you get boron in excess of 15 parts per million and salt, and basically the rooting depth is really restricted in most years. So this is the type of soils that you don't necessarily have to crop every year, but wait, this truck goes past. But this is about setting the crop up for next year, okay? Having adequate nitrogen, having adequate moisture stored, so next year is going to be a good crop. So, and that was the reason why it was planted here. So, but I might just ask Pete. Pete's been, I guess, a real pioneer with pulses. He was growing a lot of lentils in the mid-90s and doing it really well long before other people were. And he's got a very mixture of soil type. He's got some fantastic stuff you can grow anything on, and he's got some subsoil constraints. So I just want to talk to Pete and ask him about how did he make his choice on, to do stuff like this, and how does your diversity mix in your farm look today, Pete, as opposed to 10 years ago?
Well, yeah, look, we try and get a legume over every paddock at some stage. Now these ones certainly aren't our best grain legume paddocks. So, and as discussion this morning regarding the cost of nitrogen, you know, this is certainly the way that we try and introduce it into these paddocks. As far as we don't expect to harvest a grain legume off them. We're not keen on the hay job at this point. So these were primarily a brown manure paddock from day one. We'll probably brown this out in the next week or so, and then save as much moisture as we can till sowing next year, and it'll hopefully make us a low risk setup crop for next year.
Okay, so I guess the key question is probably variety wise, what's our best fit? We've seen I suppose Ace and Bolt and now Hurricane come out, and do you want to just give us your thoughts on those ones?
Yeah, well, I just want to give a quick bit of background because I think a few guys are going to ask around time of sowing and things like that here. You know, in terms of the early sown stuff on this site, all the beans, all the early sown stuff was 1st, 2nd of May, so they were the 2 early sowing dates. A herbicide tolerance trial in lentils up there was sown in about the 19th of May, and then this is the 12th of June just here, so just to give you an idea of where we fit compared to other years. And you compare this to last year, we sowed a similar date, well, pretty similar dates, and you know, last year, and yet there was stuff all difference in growth, obviously, with the later start. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it comes home, given how dry it has been. So just keep that in mind as we walk around, have a look at the site, look at the sowing dates, look at the biomass, you know, and look at the, you know, the value of that biomass in your system. I think we'll talk more about that as we get to the peas and the beans. So in terms of varieties, look, you know, we've been talking a bit about Bolt and Hurricane. Fantastic fit for the Mallee, and even Ace. Look, Ace had a bit of a rough year last year, but on a site like this one, Ace has basically topped my trials early sowing every year, other than maybe last year, but it was still up there. You know, it was around the mark, but in general last year it probably was down a bit on other varieties. Why, we're not 100% sure, but that was just the season that it got released in and it got stung a bit. So Ace is still a very good variety, but yeah, certainly Bolt and Hurricane have a fantastic fit, and we've talked plenty about the Hurricane fit in terms of herbicide tolerance, and we'll touch on that a bit more as we move up through the trial up there. I guess what we did want to highlight, and you know, Janine might want to have a few comments going forward, is earlier this season we decided to do a smaller scale release of 3 new lines, and one of them's Jumbo 2 here, and you know, you can see by just looking at it that it's actually a really good variety. That variety, the reason why it got pushed forward is we had a really good bulk up in seed, and its yields have just been amazing really, across a whole range of environments. It's got really good disease resistance, both ASCO and chocolate spot. It's a large seeded red, so potentially it's a classic where, you know, you might consider, you know, if its yields continue to hold up in a season like this one, if you're switching from flash and you want to stick into a larger seeded red, that's where a Jumbo 2 might fit. And you know, it's certainly, its yields have been up there around about the mark. You know, in the longer term trials, I think it's maybe down a fraction on Ace, but not much. So you know, in terms of the long term NVT, it's there and thereabouts at the moment.
What they're going to expect, the signs coming back in from the brokers and the buyers is it's rather strong. You'll be receiving, budget on receiving similar prices to last year, and that's all I can say on lentils at the moment. I'll continue on the other pulses when we get to them.
I'll just make a comment on the Hurricane, that we had, when we're bulking up, we had some excess seed that was had some off types in it, so we exported that to the traditional markets where Nipper lentil, the small lentil, has gone, and certainly was very well accepted, and everyone's quite comfortable. It fits into the small red lentil category. There's been good demand for that, and yes, there is more of it going to be grown now, so we may have to watch how much we grow, but in the past number of years it has been a very strong price for the small lentils. On the other flip side, the Jumbo 2 being the large lentil, so bigger than the Ace and the Bolt. Traditionally that has gone into a market where an old variety Aldinga has gone into, which is a large red lentil, and there's been good acceptance for Jumbo into those large red markets, and this Jumbo 2 will just sort of float straight into those markets, we believe, too.